Today on Primates Uncensored, you will hear about 3 chimpanzees who terrorized an entire forest ecosystem, building what can only be described as the first primate crime syndicate ever documented. This is the story of Scar, Grip, and Shadow, the trio that changed everything we thought we knew about chimpanzees' social behavior. In the heart of the Kibale forest in Uganda, among the dense canopy and winding rivers that cut through the jungle like pulsing veins, an extraordinary story began to unfold. This wasn't a common tale of survival or typical primate hierarchy. It was something far more complex, almost disturbingly human in its organization and calculated brutality. It all started when the Kibale group, a community of 42 chimpanzees inhabiting the northern sector of the reserve, woke to a scene they would never forget. The young female Keza stumbled from the dense vegetation, her face covered in blood and one arm hanging at an unnatural angle. She collapsed to the ground, trembling violently, as the entire group entered a state of alarm. Titan, the alpha male, quickly descended from his perch, his hair bristling in a display of dominance and protection. Other males positioned themselves defensively, searching for signs of leopards or snakes. But Keza, between moans of pain, did something that left everyone perplexed. With her good hand, she repeatedly gestured toward the south, beating her chest and then making a movement with 3 fingers. The older chimpanzees understood immediately. It hadn't been a predator, it had been other chimpanzees. 3 of them. Brock, a veteran male of many territorial battles, examined Keza's wounds with uncommon care. What he discovered made his blood run cold. The bite marks were meticulous, almost surgical. These weren't the frenzied bites of a common territorial fight. Someone had deliberately broken Keza's arm in 2 distinct places, and the lacerations on her face formed a pattern that seemed almost intentional. Even more disturbing was what Keza carried clutched against her chest with her good arm. It was a bundle of figs, still fresh, wrapped in large leaves. But these weren't just any figs. They were the prized fruits from the sacred fig tree in the center of Kibale territory, a tree that had fed the group for 3 generations. The tree that Titan's father had defended with his life. The tree that marked the very heart of their homeland. The message was clear and chilling. This wasn't a random attack. This was a statement. Someone had entered their territory, assaulted one of their own, and taken their most valuable resource as a trophy, and they had let Keza live specifically to deliver this message. Titan gathered the senior males for an emergency council. This was unprecedented. In all his years as alpha, through droughts, leopard attacks, and border skirmishes with neighboring groups, he had never faced anything like this. Chimpanzee warfare was brutal, but predictable. Groups fought over territory, over females, over resources. But this was different. This was organized. This was personal. As the council deliberated, the beta male, a cunning strategist named Rex, asked the question everyone was thinking but afraid to voice. Who were these 3 chimpanzees? They didn't match the scent markers of any known neighboring groups. The Mutumba group to the west were old rivals, yes, but their tactics were straightforward and their warriors well known. The Kalandi group to the east were peaceful, focused more on foraging than fighting, and the southern territories were occupied by smaller, fragmented groups that would never dare challenge the mighty Kibale. So who were they? The answer came 2 days later, and it came in the form of another attack. This time, the victim was a young male named Juma, barely past adolescence, but already showing promise as a future warrior. He was found at dawn, barely conscious, at the base of a massive mahogany tree at the western border. Like Keza, his injuries were precise and brutal. Unlike Keza, he had been stripped of something far more valuable than food. Around his neck, where he had worn a thick vine collar decorated with colorful seed pods, a mark of status among young males in the group, there was nothing but raw, abraded skin. The collar had been taken, and in its place, painted across his chest in a mixture of red clay and crushed berries, was a symbol. 3 parallel claw marks, dragging downward. Brock recognized it immediately. Though he wished he didn't, it was an old symbol, one that belonged to the ancient stories told by the eldest chimpanzees in the forest. Stories of rogue males, outcasts who had been expelled from their birth groups and had banded together in the shadows. Stories that most dismissed as myths meant to scare young chimps into obedience. But here was the symbol, painted in blood and clay, as real as the wounds on Juma's body. The 3 claws. The legend was real, and they had returned. The matriarch of the group, an ancient female named Grandmother, who had lived through more seasons than anyone could count, was brought to see the symbol. Her reaction confirmed Brock's worst fears. She let out a low, mournful hoot, the sound of deep grief and recognition. She had seen this symbol before, many years ago, when she was just a young female herself. She told the gathering about a time when 3 young males from different groups had been cast out for crimes against their communities. One had killed an infant from his own group. Another had attacked and severely wounded his own alpha in a forbidden coup attempt. The third had committed the ultimate taboo. He had hoarded food during a famine, letting others starve while he grew fat and strong. Each crime was unforgivable, each punishment swift and brutal. Exile. But instead of dying alone in the wilderness as was expected, these 3 had found each other. And together, they had become something far more dangerous than any single outcast could ever be. They had become organized, they had become strategic, they had become the nightmare that every chimpanzee community feared but hoped would never materialize. A group with no territory to defend, no infants to protect, no elderly to care for. A group with nothing to lose and everything to gain. For years, they had terrorized the southern regions, raiding weak groups, stealing food, abducting young females, and disappearing into the deep jungle before any organized resistance could form. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they vanished. Some said they had been killed by a coalition of groups who had finally united against them. Others claimed they had simply moved on to other forests, other victims. But grandmother knew better. She had always known they would return. Because the three claws didn't just raid for survival, they raided for sport, for dominance, for the pure pleasure of instilling fear. And now, after years of silence, they had set their sights on the most powerful group in Kibale, the Kibale. The question wasn't if they would strike again. The question was when, and how devastating the blow would be. Titan ordered increased patrols along all borders. Warriors were stationed at the sacred fig tree around the clock. Females and young were kept in the center of the territory, never venturing far from the protection of the males. The group moved as one cohesive unit, abandoning the usual pattern of smaller foraging parties spreading across their range. But the three claws were patient, and they were smart. For 7 days, there was nothing. No attacks, no sightings, no signs. The Kibale began to relax slightly, hoping perhaps the warnings had been enough, that the outcasts had moved on to easier prey. That hope was shattered on the 8th day. The attack came at midday, when the sun was high and the group was at its most vulnerable, spread out under the canopy, seeking shade from the oppressive heat. The sentries at the fig tree never saw it coming. One moment they were alert, scanning the undergrowth for threats. The next, they were unconscious, victims of a coordinated assault so swift and silent that not a single warning call was raised. When Titan and his warriors arrived, drawn by the sudden eerie silence where there should have been the normal chatter of sentries, they found a scene of calculated destruction. The two guards, both experienced fighters, lay crumpled at the base of the tree, breathing but unresponsive. Every single fig on the tree's lower branches had been stripped clean, and carved deep into the bark of the ancient trunk, visible from 100 meters away, was that symbol again, the three claw marks. But this time, there was more. Arranged in a neat line at the base of the tree were personal items, trophies taken from various members of the Kibale over the past weeks. Kez's favorite grooming stick, Juma's seed pod collar, a smooth river stone that belonged to one of the elders, a strip of bark that a female had been fashioning into a tool. Items that meant nothing to outsiders but everything to their owners. The message was evolving. This wasn't just about resources anymore. This was psychological warfare. The three claws were demonstrating that they could strike anywhere, anytime, and take whatever they wanted. They were inside the Kibale's collective head, and they knew it. Rex, analyzing the scene with his characteristic strategic mind, made a disturbing observation. The amount of figs taken was far more than 3 chimpanzees could possibly carry or eat, which meant one of two things. Either they had a cache somewhere nearby where they were stockpiling resources, or they were simply destroying food to starve out the Kibale. Both possibilities were equally troubling. More disturbing was the precision of the knockout blows to the sentries. Chimpanzees were brutal fighters, yes, but they typically relied on overwhelming force, multiple attackers mobbing a single target. These strikes had been surgical, efficient, each sentry taken down with what appeared to be a single, perfectly placed blow to the base of the skull. That level of skill wasn't natural. It was learned, refined, perfected through practice. How many others had the three claws attacked before turning their attention to the Kibale? How many other groups had fallen victim to these tactics? And more importantly, why had no one warned them? The answer to that last question came from an unexpected source. A stranger appeared at the eastern border, a young male bearing the scent markers of the Kibale group. He was emaciated, clearly having traveled far without proper food or rest. His eyes were wide with fear, and he carried wounds that, while healing, still told a story of recent violence. He had come with a warning, though it arrived far too late to be of much use. The Kibale, the peaceful group that had avoided conflict for generations, had been the three claws' previous target. Over the course of 2 months, they had been systematically dismantled. The outcasts hadn't waged open war. Instead, they had employed a campaign of terror so effective that the Kibale had simply disintegrated from within. Key individuals were attacked and injured, never killed, always left alive to spread fear. Food sources were poisoned with bitter roots that caused illness but not death. Nighttime raids that involved nothing more than blood-curdling screams in the darkness. Phantom attacks that left no victims but maximum psychological damage. By the end, the Kibale Alpha had been so paranoid that he had attacked his own beta male. Convinced he was a spy for the three claws, females had fled with their infants to other groups. The remaining males had scattered, each trying to find safety in isolation. The group had ceased to exist, not through conquest, but through complete psychological collapse. And the three claws had accomplished it all without sustaining a single significant injury. The messenger, whose name was Cato, begged Titan for asylum and offered everything he knew about the three claws in exchange. Titan, recognizing the value of intelligence, agreed immediately. What Cato revealed over the following hours painted a picture that was both fascinating and terrifying. The three claws weren't just three random outcasts who had found each other. They were a carefully balanced team, each member bringing unique skills that complemented the others perfectly. The first, the one that Kalandi had called Scar, was the strategist. He was older, perhaps 25 or 30 years old, with a distinctive scar running from his left eye down to his jaw. He was the planner, the one who watched and learned and devised the tactics. He never participated directly in raids unless absolutely necessary, preferring to orchestrate from a distance. The second was Grip, named for his legendary strength. He was in his prime, perhaps 15 years old, and possessed a physical power that few could match. But it wasn't just raw strength. Grip had an uncanny understanding of anatomy, of where to strike to cause maximum pain with minimum effort. He was the enforcer, the one who delivered those surgical strikes that left victims alive but traumatized. The third was the most terrifying, according to Cato, Shadow, youngest of the three, barely past adolescence, but gifted with an ability that bordered on supernatural. He could move through the forest without making a sound, could mimic the calls of dozens of different animals, and had a talent for disappearing that made him seem like a ghost. He was the scout, the infiltrator, the one who gathered intelligence and struck from unexpected angles. Together, they formed something unprecedented in chimpanzee society, a functional unit that operated with military precision, each member's weaknesses covered by another's strengths. Where a normal chimpanzee group relied on numbers and hierarchy, the three claws relied on skill, coordination, and psychological manipulation. Cato also revealed their probable location. The three claws didn't maintain a fixed territory. Instead, they operated from a series of temporary camps deep in the most inhospitable parts of the forest. Areas where the canopy was so thick that little light reached the ground. Where the undergrowth was a maze of thorns and vines, where no sane chimpanzee would willingly venture. They moved between these camps unpredictably, never staying in one place long enough to be tracked. But Cato had discovered something during his time fleeing from them. There was one location, a place that Kalandi had called the Dead Grove, where the three claws seemed to return regularly. It was a clearing where lightning had struck years ago, killing a cluster of ancient trees. The dead trunks still stood, like gray sentinels, and the ground was covered in ash that never seemed to wash away. It was a cursed place, avoided by all the groups in the region, which made it the perfect headquarters for outcasts who thrived on fear and superstition. Titan listened to all of this with growing concern. He was a fighter, had won his position through strength and courage. But this was a different kind of warfare. The three claws weren't challenging him openly for dominance. They were eroding his authority by making him appear impotent to protect his group. Every attack that went unanswered, every theft that went unpunished, every day that passed with his community living in fear was a victory for the outcasts and a defeat for him. The traditional response would be to gather his strongest warriors and hunt down the three claws, to engage them in open combat and destroy them through superior numbers. But Keto's information suggested that would be playing into their hands. Scar would anticipate such a move, would lead them into an ambush, would turn the Cassicula's strength against them. No, this required a different approach. Titan needed to think like the three claws, to anticipate their next move and counter it before it happened. He needed to become as cunning as Scar, as strong as Grip, as elusive as Shadow. He needed to beat them at their own game. Rex proposed a bold plan. Instead of waiting for the next attack, instead of reacting to the three claws' initiatives, the Cassicula would go on the offensive. But not in the way the outcasts would expect. They wouldn't send a large war party that could be easily spotted and avoided. Instead, they would send small teams, no more than 3 or 4 individuals, to patrol aggressively throughout their territory and even beyond. These teams would move constantly, unpredictably, making it impossible for the three claws to pattern their movements. The strategy was implemented immediately. Titan divided his strongest males into rotating patrol units, each led by an experienced warrior. Brock took the first team, venturing toward the western boundary where the Kalandi had once lived. Rex led another toward the southern reaches, where the forest grew thick and dark. A third team, led by a fierce female named Zara, who had earned her place through countless battles, headed east. It was exactly as Rex had predicted. Piles of stolen food, carefully organized and protected from the elements. Figs, nuts, palm fruits, even some meat from what appeared to be a colobus monkey. But more than the food, they found the trophies. Dozens of them. Personal items from not just the Kasakela and the Kalandi, but from groups Brock didn't even recognize. The three claws had been operating across a much wider range than anyone had suspected. But the most disturbing items weren't the trophies. In the corner of the cache, partially hidden under leaves, was a collection of bones, small bones, meticulously cleaned and arranged. Infant bones. The three claws weren't just thieves and raiders. They had crossed a line that even the most violent chimpanzee groups respected. They had killed infants, something so taboo that it rarely occurred even in the most brutal territorial wars. Brock immediately sent a runner back to inform Titan while he and his team maintained surveillance on the cache. The question now was whether to destroy it or use it as bait. Rex, upon hearing the news, argued vehemently for the latter. This cache represented months, perhaps years of work by the three claws. They would return to check on it, to add to it, and when they did, the Kasakela would be waiting. Titan agreed, but with modifications to the plan. Instead of a direct ambush, which the cunning Scar might anticipate, they would do something more subtle. They would take a single item, something small but significant, and leave their own message. The response came within hours, much faster than anyone had anticipated. Either the three claws had been closer than expected, or they maintained such careful watch over their caches that they noticed the intrusion almost immediately. What happened next demonstrated just how dangerous and unpredictable these outcasts truly were. They didn't attack the patrol. They didn't even attempt to track Brock's team back to the main group. Instead, they attacked a completely different target, one that no one had thought to protect. Because it seemed so obvious, so brazen, that not even the three claws would dare. They attacked the center of Kasakela territory. In broad daylight, while Titan and his strongest warriors were focused on the cache and the patrols, Shadow had somehow infiltrated past every sentry, every defensive position, and had made his way to the very heart of the Kasakela's home range. And there, in front of a dozen witnesses, he had done something that sent shockwaves through the entire community. He had taken one of Titan's own infants. The three claws had just demonstrated something terrifying. They could strike anywhere, anytime, at anyone. No one was safe. Not in the center of the territory, not surrounded by protectors, not even the Alpha's own offspring. But grandmother was right. This was a test, a challenge. The three claws were pushing Titan to see if he would make a fatal mistake, and more than that, they were sending a message to the entire Kasakela group. Your Alpha cannot protect you. Your strength means nothing. Your numbers mean nothing. We can take what we want, when we want it. Rex approached cautiously, knowing that even though Titan had calmed, Alpha was still a volcano that could erupt again at any moment. He proposed something radical, something that went against every instinct of chimpanzee social structure. He suggested that they negotiate. The idea was met with immediate outcry from the other males. Negotiate with outcasts. with criminals, with murderers of infants. It was unthinkable, shameful, an admission of weakness that would destroy Titan's authority and the Kasakela's reputation forever. But Rex persisted. He pointed out that the three claws had now demonstrated they could kill Titan's infant anytime they chose. The fact that they hadn't, the fact that they had taken him alive, meant they wanted something. They were making an offer, twisted and brutal as it was. Do what we want, and the infant lives. Refuse, and suffer the consequences. The question was, what did they want? Outcasts typically wanted reintegration into society, wanted the chance to return to a group and rebuild their status. But the three claws had spent years, perhaps decades, operating independently. They had built something unique. So what could the Kasakela possibly offer that they would want? The answer came that night, delivered in the most theatrical way possible. At sunset, as the group huddled together for safety, too terrified to spread out to their usual sleeping nests, a sound echoed through the forest. It was an infant's call, distressed but not injured, Titan's son, crying for his mother. The sound came from multiple directions, bouncing off trees, impossible to pinpoint. In that silence, something landed at the base of a tree near where Titan sat. A bundle, carefully wrapped in large leaves and tied with vines. Titan approached it cautiously, expecting some kind of trap or cruel trick. But when he unwrapped it, he found something unexpected: fresh food, high-quality fruits, nuts, even some honeycomb. And nestled in the center was a small item that made his breath catch: a tuft of hair, unmistakably from his infant son. Not torn out violently, but carefully cut. A sample, proof of life. Beneath the food was something even more unexpected: a crude drawing, scratched into a piece of bark with charcoal. It showed three figures on one side and a larger group on the other. Between them was a symbol that Brock recognized from his travels. It was an old sign, used by distant chimpanzee populations, that meant alliance or partnership. The three claws weren't demanding submission, they weren't asking for tribute or territory. They were proposing an alliance. And the implications of that proposal were staggering. Titan called his council together immediately. Grandmother, Brock, Rex, Zara, and several other senior members gathered to analyze this development. The debate was fierce. An alliance with the three claws would give the Kasakela access to their unique skills, their tactical knowledge, their ability to strike fear into neighboring groups. With the outcasts as allies instead of enemies, the Kasakela would become virtually unassailable, able to expand their territory, dominate their rivals, control the best feeding grounds across the entire region. But the cost was enormous. Accepting the three claws meant accepting their methods, their brutality, their complete disregard for the traditional laws that governed chimpanzee society. It meant becoming like them, abandoning the moral high ground that made the Kasakela respected, not just feared. And it meant forever associating with individuals who had committed infanticide, the ultimate taboo. More practically, it meant trusting outcasts who had just spent weeks terrorizing the group and kidnapping an infant. What guarantee did they have that the three claws would honor any alliance? What prevented them from simply taking what they wanted and betraying the Kasakela at the first opportunity? Grandmother posed the question that no one else dared to ask. Why now? The three claws have operated independently for years, decades even. They've destroyed multiple groups, built their reputation on fear and isolation. Why would they suddenly want allies? The answer, when it came from Rex, was chilling in its simplicity. Because they're planning something bigger, something that even they, with all their skill and cunning, cannot accomplish alone. They need numbers. They need the Kasakela's strength added to their own intelligence. Whatever they're planning, it's ambitious enough that they're willing to share the spoils. Brock added his own observation. The cache we found, the amount of food stored there, the level of organization. That's not just raiding supplies, that's preparation for an extended campaign. They're gathering resources for something long-term, something that will require sustained effort. The pieces began to fall into place. The systematic destruction of the Kalandi, the careful study of the Kasakela, the psychological warfare designed not to destroy, but to dominate. The three claws weren't random marauders, they were building something. An empire perhaps, or at least a sphere of influence that extended across multiple territories. And they had chosen the Kasakela to be their partners in this endeavor, recognizing that the strongest group in the region would make either the best ally or the most dangerous enemy. By taking Titan's infant, they had forced the choice. Join us, or watch everything you've built crumble. Titan faced an impossible decision: refuse and condemn his son to death, along with potentially the entire group, as the three claws continued their campaign of terror. Accept and become complicit in whatever brutal plans the outcasts had devised. Sacrificing the Kasakela's honor and identity, he asked each council member for their opinion. Grandmother, surprisingly, advised acceptance, but with conditions. If we're going to dance with demons, we might as well learn their steps. But we don't have to become demons ourselves. We negotiate terms. We establish boundaries. We make them prove their value before we commit fully. Brock argued for refusal, saying that any alliance with the three claws would eventually destroy the Kasakela from within. That once they opened that door, they could never close it again. Better to fight, even if it meant heavy losses, than to surrender their principles. Zara offered a middle path. We accept, but we prepare. We learn their tactics, their strategies, their secrets, and when the time is right, when we've grown strong enough, we turn on them. We use the three claws to elevate ourselves, then we eliminate them. Rex, ever the strategist, pointed out the flaws in each argument but offered no clear recommendation of his own. This was a decision that only Titan could make, one that would define his legacy and the future of the entire group. As the council deliberated, another development occurred that added urgency to their decision. Scouts reported unusual movement at the southern border. Not the three claws this time, but something potentially more threatening. The Matumba group, their old rivals, were massing warriors at the boundary line. Apparently, word had spread about the Kasakela's troubles, and the Matumba saw an opportunity to settle old scores and perhaps claim some of the Kasakela's prime feeding grounds while they were distracted. This was exactly what Grandmother had warned about. The longer the conflict with the three claws continued, the more vulnerable the Kasakela became to external threats. Other groups would sense weakness and move to exploit it. The Kasakela's reputation for strength was built on decades of successful defense and careful diplomacy. All of that was unraveling with each passing day. Titan made his decision. He would meet with the three claws, not to accept their proposal, not to refuse it, but to negotiate, to understand exactly what they wanted, what they were planning, and what role they envisioned for the Kasakela. He would buy time, gather information, and most importantly, secure the return of his son. But he wouldn't go alone, and he wouldn't go unprepared. Rex would accompany him, both for his strategic mind and as a witness. Brock would position warriors at strategic points along the route, ready to intervene if the meeting turned into an ambush. And Zara would lead a contingent in a direct confrontation with the Matumba, demonstrating that despite their internal crisis, the Kasakela were still a force to be reckoned with. The meeting was arranged through a series of calls and countercalls, a primitive but effective system of communication. The location chosen was neutral ground, a rocky outcrop that overlooked a waterfall, a place where no group held territory and where approaching from any direction would be visible from a distance. It was as safe as any meeting with the three claws could be. Titan and Rex arrived at dawn, when the light was still soft and the forest was awakening. They waited, tense and alert, scanning the surrounding trees for any sign of movement. And then, as the sun crested the horizon, they appeared. Scar emerged first, moving with a deliberate slowness that suggested complete confidence. He was older than Titan had expected, his face lined with age and experience, that distinctive scar running from his eye down his jaw like a lightning bolt frozen in flesh. His eyes were sharp, calculating, taking in every detail of Titan and Rex's posture, positioning, readiness, grip followed, and his size was intimidating even from a distance. He wasn't just large, he was massive, muscles rippling under his coat in ways that suggested strength far beyond what should be natural. But his movements were controlled, precise. Not the lumbering gait of a brute, but the careful steps of someone who knew exactly how much force they could bring to bear. Shadow was last, and he seemed to materialize rather than approach. One moment the space behind Grip was empty, the next Shadow was there, as if he had always been present but invisible. He was younger, as Kato had described, but his eyes held an intensity that belied his age. He cradled something against his chest, and Titan's heart leaped when he recognized his infant son, alive and apparently unharmed. The four chimpanzees faced each other across the rocky outcrop, the waterfall providing a constant roar that would mask any other sounds, any potential ambush approaching. Scar made the first move, sitting down deliberately and placing his hands palm up on his knees, the universal chimpanzee gesture of peaceful intent. Grip and Shadow followed suit, with Shadow carefully placing the infant on the ground in front of him, still within his reach but visible to Titan. Titan forced himself to remain calm, to not rush forward and snatch his son. This was a test, he knew, a display of discipline and control. He and Rex sat as well, mirroring Scar's posture, establishing the formal parameters of a negotiation. Scar began to vocalize, a series of grunts and hoots that were surprisingly articulate. He was telling a story, Titan realized, the story of the three claws, how they had been cast out, how they had suffered alone, how they had found each other and forged something new. There was no apology in his tone, no shame about their crimes. Instead, there was pride, a sense of accomplishment at having survived and thrived despite being rejected by their birth communities. He spoke of vision, of a future where strength and cunning mattered more than tradition and arbitrary social rules. He described a forest where the strong truly ruled, not through lineage or luck, but through merit and capability. A forest where the three claws and the Kasakela together would form an unbreakable alliance that no other group would dare challenge. Then Scar shifted to practical matters. He outlined what he called the Grand Campaign. There were 7 major chimpanzee groups in the Kibale region. The Kalandi were already destroyed, scattered to the winds. The Kasakela were the strongest and would form the core of the alliance. The Matumba, currently gathering at the border, would be the next target. Their defeat would be swift and complete, not through outright warfare, but through the same psychological tactics that had broken the Kalandi. After the Matumba would come the smaller groups, absorbed one by one, until the entire northern forest was under unified control. The resources this would provide, the territory, the females, the security from outside threats, all would be shared according to contribution. The three claws would provide the strategy and special operations. The Kasakela would provide the numbers and legitimacy. Together, they would create something unprecedented in chimpanzee history. Scar paused, letting his words settle. Then he made his final point, the one that carried the most weight. The world was changing. Human activity was encroaching on the forest from all sides. Logging operations, agricultural expansion, roads cutting through ancient territories. The traditional way of doing things, scattered groups competing with each other, wouldn't survive this new threat. Only by uniting, by pooling resources and strength, could the chimpanzees of Kibale hope to maintain their existence. It was a compelling argument, Titan had to admit, and it was delivered with a sophistication that demonstrated Scar was not just a brutal outcast, but a genuine visionary. However twisted his methods might be, Rex, sitting beside Titan, was clearly processing the implications. His strategic mind recognizing both the opportunities and the dangers in Scar's proposal. Titan responded with his own vocalizations, measured and deliberate. He acknowledged the threat the three claws posed, acknowledged their capabilities and their vision. But he also laid out his own conditions. The infant would be returned immediately, unharmed, as a gesture of good faith. The attacks on the Kasakela would cease completely, and any alliance would be provisional, subject to review and renegotiation as circumstances evolved. More importantly, Titan insisted on boundaries. The Kasakela would not participate in infanticide. They would not torture prisoners. They would not poison food sources. There were lines that, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. If the three claws wanted the Kasakela's strength and numbers, they would have to accept some limitations on their methods. Scar's response was surprising. He agreed, almost immediately, with a gesture that suggested these conditions were expected and acceptable. Shadow stood and carefully carried the infant across the space between them, placing the young chimpanzee in Titan's arms. The reunion was brief but emotional, Titan quickly checking his son for injuries and finding none. The infant was thin, clearly stressed, but alive and functional. This gesture, the immediate return of the hostage, told Titan something important. The three claws were serious about this alliance. They weren't just manipulating him. They genuinely saw value in cooperation, which made them either honest partners or dangerously sophisticated liars. Time would tell which. The negotiation continued for hours, working out details, establishing protocols, discussing the campaign against the Grip spoke for the first time, his voice surprisingly soft given his massive frame, describing the tactical approach they would use. Shadow demonstrated some of his stealth techniques, explaining how he could infiltrate enemy territory and gather intelligence. Scar laid out a timeline, a sequence of operations that would unfold over the coming weeks. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the framework of an alliance had been established. It was tentative, conditional, and built on a foundation of mutual suspicion, but it existed. The three claws and the Kasakela would work together, at least for now, to neutralize the Matamba threat and consolidate control over the northern territories. As the meeting concluded, Scar made one final statement that sent chills down Titan's spine. "We chose you, Titan, because you're strong enough to be useful and smart enough to be dangerous. Don't make us regret that choice. And don't think for a moment that we haven't planned for the possibility of betrayal. If you turn on us, you'll discover that what we've shown you so far was merely a taste of what we were capable of." The threat was clear, but so was the respect. The three claws viewed Titan as an equal, or at least close to it, which was more than they had ever offered any other alpha. It was a strange kind of honor, wrapped in menace. The return to the Kasakela territory was tense. Titan carried his infant son, who clung to him desperately, traumatized but alive. Rex walked beside him, already formulating plans for how to present this alliance to the group. They both knew that many would oppose it, that Brock in particular would see it as a betrayal of everything the Kasakela stood for. They were right. When Titan called an assembly and announced the alliance, the reaction was explosive. Brock stood immediately, his posture aggressive, demanding to know how Titan could even consider working with the outcasts who had terrorized them. Other males joined in, vocalizing their displeasure, beating their chests in displays of defiance. But Titan had expected this. He let them vent, let them express their outrage, and then he presented the alternative. The Matumba were at their borders, sensing weakness. Other groups would follow. The humans were closing in from all sides, destroying the forest piece by piece. The traditional approach, isolated groups defending their own small territories, was failing. The Kibale proved that. They needed to adapt or face extinction. And then he played his strongest card. He revealed what Scar had told him about the human threat, information that the three claws had gathered through their wide-ranging travels. Logging operations were planned for the southern forest within the next 2 years. A road was being surveyed that would cut directly through what was currently Matumba territory. Agricultural settlements were expanding from the east, clearing land for crops. The forest, as they knew it, was dying. And when it was gone, what would their traditions and honor mean? Would they take pride in their principles as they starved in the shrinking fragments of jungle? Or would they do whatever was necessary to survive, even if it meant alliance with outcasts? Grandmother spoke up, supporting Titan's position. She reminded the group that survival had always required adaptation. Their ancestors had survived droughts, predators, diseases, and territorial wars by being flexible, by learning, by doing what was necessary. This was no different, just on a larger scale. Slowly, reluctantly, the opposition began to crumble. Not because they agreed with the alliance, but because they couldn't offer a better alternative. The reality of their situation was undeniable. They were besieged on all sides, by both chimpanzee rivals and human encroachment. The three claws offered a path forward, however, morally questionable. Brock was the last to acquiesce, and even then, he made his position clear. I will follow you in this, Titan, because you are our alpha and because I see no other choice. But know that I will be watching. The moment the three claws betray us, the moment they push us to cross lines that cannot be uncrossed, I will oppose you openly. An alliance built on fear and brutality cannot stand forever. His words were prophetic, though no one realized it at the time. The campaign against the Matumba began 3 days later. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare, coordinated between the three claws' cunning and the Kasakela's strength. Shadow infiltrated Matumba territory, spreading false information, creating the impression that there were threats where none existed. Grip led targeted strikes against key individuals, never killing but always leaving lasting impressions. The Kasakela warriors, meanwhile, conducted visible patrols along the border, a show of strength that suggested they were preparing for full-scale war. The combination was devastating. The Matumba Alpha, already on edge from the mysterious attacks, interpreted the Kasakela's movements as preparation for invasion and began pulling his forces back from the border to defend the core territory. This created exactly the opening Scar had predicted. With the Matumba concentrated in the center of their range, their outlying feeding grounds were left vulnerable. The three claws and select Kasakela teams moved in, not to hold territory but to deny resources. They stripped fruit trees, fouled water sources with debris, drove away prey animals. Within a week, the Matumba were facing food shortages despite being in the middle of their own territory. The psychological pressure intensified. Shadow began his night raids, blood-curdling screams in the darkness, phantom attacks that left no victims but maximum fear. The Matumba started sleeping in tight clusters, exhausted sentries jumping at every sound. Paranoia spread like disease through the group. Titan watched all of this with mixed emotions. The tactics were effective, brutally so, but they felt wrong. This wasn't honorable combat, wasn't the kind of conflict that allowed both sides to maintain dignity. This was systematic psychological destruction, designed to break the Matumba without giving them a chance to fight back. But he couldn't deny the results. 2 weeks into the campaign, the Matumba were a shell of their former selves. Their alpha had become erratic, attacking his own subordinates over imagined slights. Females were fleeing with their infants, seeking safety in other groups. The remaining males were so demoralized that they barely responded to incursions into their territory. And then Scar delivered the final blow. He arranged for a meeting with the Matumba Alpha, a negotiation similar to the one he had conducted with Titan. But the terms offered to the Matumba were far harsher. They would surrender their entire territory, would be absorbed into the growing Kasakela Three Claws coalition as subordinate members, would accept designated status with no hope of climbing the hierarchy. The alternative was complete annihilation. The Matumba Alpha, broken and desperate, accepted. The northern forest now belonged to the Alliance. The Kasakela territory had effectively tripled in size, giving them access to feeding grounds that could support a much larger population. The displaced Matumba males were integrated into the group's lower ranks, carefully watched but provided with food and protection. The females and young were absorbed more easily, following the natural pattern of chimpanzee society. To the outside observer, it looked like a resounding success. The Kasakela had become the undisputed power in the region, had neutralized a longtime rival without losing a single member in combat. Titan's status had been elevated to legendary, an alpha who had achieved through cunning what others could only dream of achieving through force. But inside the group, cracks were beginning to show. The methods used against the Matumba had left a stain, a sense of shame that couldn't be easily washed away. Young males who had participated in the psychological warfare struggled with what they had done. With the screams of fear they had caused, with the knowledge that they had broken warriors without ever giving them a fair fight. Brock's faction, those who had opposed the alliance from the beginning, grew larger and more vocal. They argued that the Kasakela had lost something essential in their transformation, that they had traded their soul for territory. Zara, surprisingly, joined their ranks, saying that while she had initially supported using the 3 claws, she hadn't anticipated how it would change the group's fundamental nature. Rex remained Titan's strongest supporter, arguing that moral qualms were a luxury they couldn't afford. The expansion had been necessary, the methods regrettable, but effective. And most importantly, they now had the strength to face whatever challenges came next. Whether from rival chimpanzees or encroaching humans, the 3 claws, meanwhile, had established themselves within the expanded territory. They didn't claim a specific area but instead moved freely, maintaining their nomadic pattern, but now with the implicit protection and support of the Kasakela, they had become something like special advisors, consulted on matters of strategy and security but not integrated into the daily social structure. Scar began training select Kasakela males in advanced tactics, creating what amounted to an elite force. These weren't the strongest warriors, but the smartest, the most adaptable, the ones who could think strategically rather than just fight instinctively. Grip worked with the group's fighters, teaching them his precision strike techniques, showing them how to disable opponents with minimal effort. Shadow ran covert operations, gathering intelligence on neighboring groups, mapping the forest, identifying potential threats and opportunities. Scar called an emergency council, including not just Titan and his senior advisors, but representatives from all factions within the expanded group. Even Brock, despite his opposition to the alliance, recognized that this threat transcended their internal conflicts. The discussion was intense and wide-ranging. Some argued for abandoning the territory and migrating deeper into the forest, beyond the reach of the logging operations. Migration was temporary at best. The humans would eventually reach any place they fled to. The only viable option was indirect resistance combined with adaptation. He proposed a multifaceted approach. First, they would make the area as difficult to log as possible without direct confrontation. This meant targeting survey equipment, confusing trail markers, making the forest appear more difficult to navigate than it actually was. Find ways to benefit from human presence, access food sources associated with human settlements, demonstrate intelligence in ways that would make killing them socially unacceptable to humans. The proposal was met with horror by traditional members of the group. Live alongside humans, the same creatures that were destroying their forest. It seemed like surrender, like accepting subjugation. But Scar was insistent. The choice wasn't between freedom and coexistence. The choice was between extinction and adaptation. Titan found himself in the impossible position of mediating between the 3 claws, radical pragmatism, and his own group's traditional values. He understood Scar's logic, could see the cold rationality behind every proposal. But he also felt the emotional pull of Brock's position, the desire to resist, to fight, to go down defending their homeland rather than compromising it away. The decision was delayed as scouts were sent to verify Shadow's information and assess the full scope of the human threat. What they found was worse than reported. Not only was logging underway in the south, but agricultural development was accelerating from the east, and a road construction project was being planned that would bisect what remained of the forest. The chimpanzees of Kibale were being systematically boxed in, their habitat fragmented into smaller and smaller pieces. And the timeline for all of this was measured in months, not years. The crisis wasn't approaching, it was already here. Faced with undeniable evidence, even the most traditional members of the group had to acknowledge that drastic action was required. Titan authorized the implementation of Scar's plan, with one significant modification. They would try and direct resistance and attempted coexistence, but they would also prepare for the possibility that both approaches would fail. Secret caches would be established in the deepest, most inaccessible parts of the forest. Emergency evacuation routes would be mapped, and the group would maintain the capability to relocate on short notice if necessary. The resistance campaign began subtly. Shadow and his trained scouts would venture to the logging sites at night, moving equipment, hiding tools, generally creating enough confusion to slow operations. They were careful never to be seen, never to leave obvious signs of chimpanzee involvement. To the human workers, it seemed like nothing more than bad luck and poor organization. Simultaneously, select members of the group began appearing near human observation posts, areas where researchers and tourists came to view wildlife. They performed displays, showed tool use, demonstrated family bonds. The goal was to make themselves sympathetic, to put faces on the abstract concept of endangered chimpanzees. The strategy showed early promise. Word spread among human communities about the remarkable chimpanzees of Kibale, their complex social structures, their intelligence. Conservation groups began to take notice, started asking questions about the logging operations, raising concerns about the impact on wildlife. But success came with unexpected consequences. The attention attracted to the chimpanzees also attracted a darker kind of human interest. Poachers, seeing an opportunity in the high-profile coverage, began targeting the group. Young chimpanzees were particularly valuable in the illegal pet trade, and the expanded Kibale territory made them easier to find. The first abduction occurred on a foggy morning, much like the one when Keza had been attacked by the three claws all those months ago. A young female named Nia simply vanished from a foraging party. The search revealed tracks, not chimpanzee, but human, leading away from the area, and at the edge of the territory, they found evidence of a vehicle. Something the chimpanzees had learned to recognize from their observations of logging operations. Nia was gone, taken by humans for purposes the chimpanzees could only imagine. The loss hit the group hard, not just because of Nia herself but because of what it represented. They had tried to use human interest to save themselves, and instead, they had painted targets on their backs. Brock saw this as vindication of his position. The idea was met with stunned silence. Hunt humans, it violated every survival instinct chimpanzees possessed. Humans were dangerous, unpredictable, possessed weapons that could kill from impossible distances. Even the three claws, with all their tactical sophistication, had never suggested direct confrontation with humans. But Scar laid out his reasoning. The poachers operated in small groups, 2 or 3 humans at most, and they relied on stealth and speed. They couldn't call for help, couldn't bring in reinforcements, because their activity was illegal. If a poaching team simply disappeared in the forest, if their vehicle was found abandoned with no trace of the occupants, it would send a powerful message. The Kibale chimpanzees were not easy prey. Moreover, Scar argued, humans had a psychological vulnerability that chimpanzees could exploit. Humans expected wildlife to flee from them, to be afraid. They didn't expect organized resistance, didn't anticipate that their prey might be intelligent enough to plan counterattacks. That assumption could be turned into a weakness. Titan was torn. Everything about this felt wrong, felt like crossing a line that would fundamentally change what it meant to be a chimpanzee. But he thought about Nia, about her fate in human hands, about all the other young ones who would follow her if the poaching continued. He thought about the logging operations destroying their forest, about the roads and farms closing in from all sides, and he realized that the old rules, the traditional ways, simply didn't apply anymore. He authorized a single operation, a test of whether Scar's theory could work in practice. If they could successfully deter one poaching team, they would consider expanding the approach. If they failed, they would abandon the idea and find another way. The preparation was meticulous. Shadow scouted the areas where poaching had occurred, identified patterns in how the humans operated. They came in from the eastern edge, used vehicles to get close to the territory, then proceeded on foot with tranquilizer guns and nets. They targeted lone juveniles or small groups separated from the main community. They operated primarily in early morning when visibility was low and the chimpanzees were just beginning their daily activities. Grip worked with a team of the strongest males, teaching them how to disable humans without killing them. The goal wasn't murder, but deterrence. They would strike hard enough to terrify, to injure, to make the cost of poaching too high to be worth the reward. But they would stop short of lethal force, both because killing humans would bring down devastating retaliation and because it would cross a moral threshold that even Scar recognized as dangerous. The trap was set using a juvenile male named Kibale, ironically the same individual who had brought warning about the 3 claws months earlier. He volunteered to act as bait, deliberately separating from his group in an area where poachers had been active. Hidden in the trees above and in the undergrowth around him were 12 of the Alliance's best warriors, including Grip and 2 of the Kasakela's most experienced fighters. They waited for 3 days before the poachers appeared. 2 humans, both male, both carrying equipment that the chimpanzees had learned to recognize. Tranquilizer guns, nets, a transport cage. They approached Kato carefully, professionally, clearly experienced at this work. Kato played his part perfectly, appearing distressed and lost, exactly the kind of vulnerable target that poachers sought. The humans moved closer, one readying the tranquilizer gun while the other prepared the net. They were confident, relaxed, performing a routine operation they had done countless times before. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously. Grip dropped from above, landing on the man with the tranquilizer gun with such force that the human went down instantly, the weapon flying from his grip. 2 Kasakela warriors burst from the undergrowth, hitting the second human before he could react to his partner's fall. The remaining warriors formed a perimeter, cutting off any escape route. The violence was controlled but overwhelming. Grip had taught his team exactly where to strike to cause pain and disable without causing permanent damage. The humans were beaten, their equipment destroyed, their vehicles' tires shredded by strong teeth and hands. But they were left alive, conscious, terrified, but functional. Then came the psychological component. Shadow appeared, moving among the injured humans with unnatural silence. He looked each man in the eyes, ensuring they saw intelligence, saw purpose, saw something that didn't fit their expectations of what a wild animal should be. Then he led them to their damaged vehicle, pushed them inside, and watched as they fled, driving on shredded tires, leaving a trail of rubber and oil. The message had been delivered. The Kibale chimpanzees would not be easy victims. They were organized, intelligent, and willing to fight back. The poachers who escaped would spread that message, would warn others that this particular forest held dangers beyond leopards and snakes. The operation was a success, but the aftermath was complicated. The warriors who had participated were changed by the experience. They had attacked humans, had hurt them deliberately, had looked into their eyes and seen fear. Some felt empowered, exhilarated by the reversal of the typical human-chimpanzee dynamic. Others felt disturbed, as if they had violated some fundamental natural law. Brock's reaction was predictably negative. He argued that they had now started a war they couldn't win, that humans would respond with overwhelming force once word of the attack spread. But days passed, then weeks, and no retaliation came. The poachers hadn't reported the incident, couldn't without admitting to their illegal activities, and without a report, there was no response. More importantly, poaching activity in the area dropped to nearly zero. Word had indeed spread, but not to authorities. It had spread through the underground network of poachers and smugglers. The message simple and clear. Stay away from Kibale. The chimpanzees there are different, dangerous, not worth the risk. The Alliance had achieved something remarkable. They had successfully deterred a human threat through intelligence and coordinated action. It was unprecedented, and it fundamentally changed how the group viewed their relationship with humans. They weren't helpless victims of human activity. They could resist, could fight back in ways that mattered. But Scar warned against overconfidence. The poachers were criminals, operating in the shadows, easily deterred because they couldn't seek official support. The logging operations were different. They were legal, backed by government permits and corporate resources. Fighting them would require different tactics, more subtlety, and likely wouldn't be as successful. The indirect resistance to logging continued, but with increasing desperation as the operations crept closer to Kasakela territory. Despite the best efforts of Shadow's scouts to confuse and delay, the humans were relentless, systematic, unstoppable. Month by month, the forest shrank, the sound of chainsaws echoing through valleys that had known only natural sounds for millennia. The group began to fracture under the pressure. Some advocated for migration, abandoning the traditional territory and seeking safety deeper in the forest. Others wanted to escalate resistance, to apply the anti-poaching tactics to the logging operations despite the risks. A minority growing larger each day simply wanted to return to the old ways to pretend the alliance had never happened, that the 3 claws were still enemies, that if they just went back to normal somehow, everything would be okay. Titan found himself losing control of the narrative. His alliance with the 3 claws, once seen as a bold strategic move, was now viewed by many as the source of all their problems. Brock openly questioned his leadership, arguing that the alliance had attracted unwanted attention, had changed the group's fundamental nature. had led them down a path from which there was no return. The crisis came to a head when a logging road reached the western edge of what had been Matumba territory. For the first time, humans and the expanded Kasekela group were in direct, unavoidable contact. The chimpanzees watched from the trees as massive machines tore through the forest, as trees that had stood for centuries fell in minutes. As the landscape they had known all their lives was transformed into muddy wasteland, and the humans watched back, some with curiosity, some with cameras, documenting the chimpanzees watching the destruction of their habitat. The footage spread across human communication networks, generating sympathy, outrage, and ultimately, a response that no one had anticipated. Conservation organizations mobilized, putting pressure on the logging company and the government agencies that had approved the operation. Protests formed in distant cities, human activists demanding protection for the Kibale chimpanzees. Legal challenges were filed, arguing that the logging permits had been issued without proper environmental review. The situation that had seemed hopeless suddenly had a glimmer of possibility. But the glimmer came with complications. The attention brought researchers, legitimate scientists who wanted to study this remarkable group of chimpanzees who had demonstrated such sophisticated behavior. And with the researchers came rules, restrictions, human management of the very territory the chimpanzees called home. The Kasekela found themselves in a strange position. Their forest was being protected. The logging operations halted pending legal review, but they were no longer truly wild. Human observers tracked their movements, documented their behaviors, interfered when they deemed it necessary. Young chimpanzees who showed signs of illness were captured and treated. Injured individuals were darted and taken for medical care, returned weeks later with scars and trauma from the experience. It was a gilded cage, protection purchased at the cost of autonomy. Scar had predicted this, had warned that seeking human help would come with strings attached, but even he hadn't anticipated how pervasive the human presence would become. The three claws, ironically, were the most affected. Their entire existence had been built on remaining hidden, on operating in the shadows beyond the reach of both chimpanzee society and human observation. But now there was nowhere to hide. The researchers documented everything, built comprehensive records of every individual in the territory, including the three infamous outcasts. Shadow adapted best, using his natural stealth to avoid observation most of the time. But Grip, and especially Scar, struggled with the constant surveillance. For Scar, who had built his reputation on being unpredictable and unknown, having his every move recorded and analyzed was a special kind of torture. The alliance began to dissolve, not through dramatic confrontation but through slow erosion. The three claws spent more and more time at the edges of the territory, avoiding both the researchers and the main Kasekela group. Their training programs stopped. Their strategic advice became less frequent. Their presence faded from daily life. Titan tried to maintain the relationship, recognizing that the alliance had achieved real results despite its costs. The Kasekela controlled more territory than ever, had faced down human threats that would have destroyed other groups, had become the most studied and protected chimpanzee community in the region. But he couldn't deny that something essential had been lost in the process. Brock saw the three claws withdrawal as an opportunity. He began advocating more openly for a return to traditional leadership, arguing that the emergency that had justified the alliance was over, that it was time to rebuild the group's identity around its original values. He gained support, particularly among younger males who had never fully accepted the outcasts, and older individuals who remembered what the Kasekela had been before the alliance. The confrontation, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic. Titan called an assembly, something he hadn't done since the early days of the alliance. The entire group gathered, including the three claws, who arrived separately and positioned themselves at the periphery, already seeming like outsiders. Titan spoke first, acknowledging both the successes and failures of the alliance. He thanked the three claws for their contributions, recognized that their intervention had likely saved the group from destruction, but also admitted that the cost had been higher than anticipated. He proposed a formal dissolution of the alliance, with the three claws granted safe passage through Kasekela territory and a promise of non-aggression, but no longer having any role in the group's decision-making or operations. Scar's response was measured, almost as if he had been expecting this moment. He agreed to the terms without argument, without attempt at negotiation. He simply stood, called to Grip and Shadow, and prepared to leave. But before departing, he made one final statement that would echo long after he was gone. You've chosen safety over strength, tradition over adaptation. I understand it, even respect it, but know this. The world is changing faster than any of us can comprehend. The humans will continue to encroach, will continue to fragment the forest, will continue to reduce your world piece by piece. You've found temporary protection, but it's conditional, dependent on human goodwill and political winds that can shift without warning. We offered you a different path, a harder path, but one that would have made you truly powerful, truly independent. You've rejected it, and that's your choice to make. But when the protection fails, when the researchers leave, when the legal battles are lost and the chainsaws return, remember that you had an alternative. Remember that we showed you what chimpanzees could be if they were willing to adapt, to evolve, to become something more than traditional society allows. We're leaving, but we're not disappearing. Out there, beyond your protected borders, the world is still wild, still dangerous, still requiring the skills we've developed. If you ever change your minds, if you ever decide that survival matters more than tradition, you know how to find us. With that, the three claws departed, moving through the assembled Kasekala with a dignity that was impossible to ignore. Shadow paused briefly beside Kato, the young male who had served as bait in the anti-poaching operation, and passed him something, a small stone, smooth and dark, marked with 3 scratches, a gift, or perhaps a reminder. Then they were gone, vanishing into the forest with the same mysterious efficiency that had characterized their first appearance. The Kasekala watched them go with mixed emotions. Relief, certainly, that the complicated relationship was ending, but also uncertainty, a nagging question about whether they had made the right choice. Life returned to something resembling normal, or at least a new version of normal that incorporated the permanent human presence. The group settled into routines, developed relationships with the researchers, learned which humans could be trusted and which should be avoided. Young chimpanzees grew up knowing nothing but this managed existence, unable to imagine the wild, unobserved life their elders remembered. Titan remained alpha, but his authority was diminished. His decisions now subject to second-guessing and challenge in ways that would have been unthinkable before. Brock became the voice of the traditional faction, not quite staging a coup, but wielding influence that rivaled Titan's own. Rex, ever the pragmatist, navigated between the factions, maintaining working relationships with both while committing fully to neither. The forest continued to shrink, despite the legal protections. Logging operations were halted in some areas, but continued in others. Roads were rerouted but still built. Agricultural expansion slowed but never stopped. The humans called it compromise, balanced development, sustainable use. The chimpanzees experienced it as slow strangulation, death by 1,000 cuts rather than a single catastrophic blow. 3 years after the alliance dissolved, a new crisis emerged. The research station that had been monitoring the Kasekala lost its funding. Government priorities shifted, conservation budgets were cut, and the humans who had been documenting and protecting the group simply packed up and left. The legal protections remained on paper, but without active enforcement, they meant nothing. Within weeks, the logging operations resumed. The road construction that had been delayed restarted. The poachers, learning